Houdini's scrapbooks. He has a lot of scrapbooks, and he cut out everything from scientific magazines about new developments in science, and he made little notes in the margin about how this could be made into a new trick, you see.
His books, his personal books.
Yes, these are his own scrapbooks. He pasted in things from the New York Times or from science journal and so on. And he made little comments in the margin about it, about how this could be made into a trick and so on. And so they were, in a way, so the magic shows were often in the nature of science fiction. And now all these illusions that they performed on the stage, the magicians did, and which they took around the world also to magic theaters, when film came along, all these things could be done more easily on film. So film very quickly wiped out the magician. A few magicians remain, mostly magicians that do things close-up magic with hands and prestidigitation and legerdemain. But the big illusions, that can be done better by Hollywood. So you have the magician almost being wiped out, not quite. He survives in various forms. He still entertains people at parties. But the more elaborate magic that was done in the magic theaters, that has been taken over by the motion picture business. In fact, many of the most successful early motion picture people became, were magicians who were recycled and became motion picture producers. Now, Houdini himself produced 7 feature films. And we have many. I found something like 30 different early film producers who had been magicians and who took up this new form of magic and became producers. The company that became Warner Brothers was started by 2 magicians, and so on. So this is the story I was trying to tell in that book called The Magician and the Cinema, which I wrote while I was at the Library of Congress and could study
Yeah, the book is The Magician and the
Cinema. The Magician and the Cinema, yes, yeah.
Yeah, in your opinion, what makes people go to theater or go to see a magician? What makes people go there?
Well, it gives you gives you a glimpse of excitement beyond your own life. It may be give you a glimpse of something happening somewhere else, or something happening in the past, or something that may happen in the future. And that's the sort of thing you go to Disneyland for, and that's the sort of thing you went to the magicians for. Now, it always interests people and surprises them when I tell them that in most countries in the world, the first people who saw a film saw it as part of a magic show, because the magicians took this invention around, and somewhere in the magic show there was something called living pictures, and you saw the Tsar of Russia being crowned in 1896, the new Tsar of Russia being crowned, and you saw a bullfight in Spain, and you saw military parades and so on in Paris or wherever. And now when I tell that to students, they say, well, how could they possibly think of it as magic? Well, my answer is, how could they not think of it as magic? Because they knew the Tsar had no business walking across a room in Hong Kong. So they knew it was a trick, a magic trick. The question should really be turned around, and you should ask, how is it that we, watching an event like that on the television screen, think we are watching an actual event and have forgotten that we are watching a magic process, technical process, very ingenious, but we have forgotten completely and ignored the fact. We have the feeling that we are watching reality. So this is a dangerous illusion in a way, because this is really a manufactured reality, or it can be.
Can be very dangerous.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So that's, I find it interesting in that respect to talk about the evolution of the magic business into the magic film business.
You have also a book about the sponsor, telling how sponsoring a film or a video can, you know, can get people attached to the sponsoring system and so on.
Yes,
Talk a little about this.
I wrote a book, and I wrote that under a grant from the Smithsonian, the Woodrow Wilson Center. I wrote the book on the relationship of the sponsor to the motion picture and television businesses. Now, of course, we've always had patrons of the arts who help to finance things. At one time, they were princes, dukes, and now they are corporations. And I find this very interesting, and the question of how much they influence what gets produced is an interesting sociological question, and that is what I go into in some detail in the book called The Sponsor, Notes on a Modern Potentate. That's the subtitle is Notes on a Modern Potentate. And that's a film, that is a book that came out shortly after I retired from Columbia University, and is used as a textbook in many university courses, and those are likely to be sociology courses rather than film courses.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you have any conclusion about it, or just the forms in which the sponsoring?
No, I'm interested not only in the form. I'm interested in the influence, and what I say is that it is far more extensive than we can imagine. Things which cannot be sponsored have great difficulty being produced or distributed, so that the money from commercial sponsors, at least in this country, is an enormous factor in determining what gets produced and what gets distributed. And an awful lot of things that are really very valuable get pushed to the margins of the media. Appear and it applies to printed material too. All that material goes into the fringes of the television schedule, and even into non-commercial television, and reaches a much smaller audience because it is not backed by large production funds and large distribution funds and production and distribution facilities. So yes, I think it's an enormous influence, and I try to discuss it in some detail, and I'm alarmed about it.
Good. I expect to read it soon. About your book, the documentary, what we have noticed is that more and more the documentaries take the film as a tool to get involved in a certain subject, most of actually connected to social reality and so on, and make it as more and more as a way to interfere on reality, at least in his wish. That's right?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you're saying.
I mean, in the chapters we have here.
There are various ways. I mean, the urge to make a documentary comes partly from various forms, and some filmmakers, some documentarists are a kind of reporter, and some are a kind of poet, and some are a kind of visual artist. So you have, and some also are. Now, some of the people who make films about things going on nowadays, I mean, some are biographers and some are historians, but some of the people who make films about events of the current time try to follow, this is the cinema verite movement, they try to follow an event without in any way interfering with it. And the equipment that we have nowadays almost makes that possible, because you have equipment with which you can even keep track of things that are moving, and of the sounds that are made, and of the things that are said, and of what you see. So you have a complete sight and sound description of what's going on. However, there are others who say the camera always interferes with what's going on, and you should take advantage of this, and the filmmaker can be a kind of catalyst. That is, he can stimulate events, and far from that creating an artificial event, according to Jean Rouch, for example, people can be, by some artificial situation, be prodded into saying things that are more true to their inner nature than they would normally produce and say in a mixed circle. So now you're sitting here photographing me talking. I wouldn't be sitting here talking if you weren't here with your camera. So in other words, this is an event that you are creating, but that doesn't mean that it's a false event. In fact, because it's being photographed, I am very careful about what I say, and I'm trying to very carefully to say the truth. And if there were no camera here, I might be much more casual.
Truth, well,
yeah, yeah.
truth. But I mean, here, at least, and to the 70s, the documentaries came from an advocate and poet and chronicler, and then observer, and then catalyst, and then
all those things. This is not chronological. All those things are still going on. All those kinds of documentaries are still being produced. There are still people who are producing films because of the visual excitement of the material, but those things overlap to some extent, of course. But you know, many films are produced because by explorers, by people who are going to faraway places and mysterious locations and bringing back a report to back home of what it is like out there in the other part of the world. Some, I mean, they're trying to document an event. Some people make film in order to document some scientific experiment, to show what goes on in the animal world, for instance. And then a lot of others are showing, for instance, you make a film to show a dancer, how other dancers have danced and how they themselves have danced, because you don't know how you dance until you have seen a film of yourself dancing. So this is a kind of documentation that becomes a teaching tool, very valuable for the teaching of dancing and athletics. I mean, almost all football teams now are coached by seeing themselves in action and seeing what's wrong with it. Tennis players, very valuable tool. So you have a lot of different motives, and they're all fascinating, and they're all still going on.
Yeah, since someone promotes a film as one of these missions, let's say, as a catalyst, other people, you have all the uses before and plus this use, and
yes, that's true. Yes,
it
becomes, the options become more complicated. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Now the very first one was certainly, when Lumière talked about a documentaire, he meant a travel film. This is documenting what it was like in other countries. Now the minute his representatives arrived, let's say, in a place like Russia, and happened to come there at the time when a new Tsar was about to be crowned, they wanted to make a film of it. And they did make a film, and they got permission to make a film of it. So immediately then you get involved in politics. Now what happened there was that the crowd of people, the masses of people, fell through some surface into a cistern, and many people were killed by this accident. And immediately the Tsar's agents seized all the cameras on the, that were present on the spot and suppressed and destroyed everything having to do with that accident. So the coronation survives, but not the accidents that took place at the time. So you have suddenly the film precipitating a censorship operation, and the film gets involved in politics. See, so it's the role of the film becomes much more complex. The film then is a propagandist by the fact that it promotes one event and shows one event and isn't allowed to show another. It becomes a teacher. It becomes an explorer. It becomes an anthropologist, and so on. It becomes an athletic coach. Yeah. So the more complicated the world gets, the more complicated the role of the documentarist, and it has many different and interesting roles. It's becoming a more pervasive instrument than you can imagine. Yeah.
In Brazil, we don't have a large production of documentaries, but we use them in closed circuit as much as was used in Challenge for Change 20 years ago. But I wonder, either in Brazil or now at United States, how is it really, it's really worthy, I say, in a mass perspective, is how many people watch a documentary which eventually can be shown on a PBS local station. But it seems that people are more concerned about documentaries, but it's not really making things change. It seems to me.
Well, you're quite right. It exists on the fringes of society. The documentarist is always aware that he is not operating in the center of the film industry of his country, and that's true everywhere. But part of that is because occasionally it is very influential on people's, so that people are afraid of the documentary, and they sort of keep pushing it to the side. Now, it's partly that what the fiction film is more emotionally satisfying because it's made for that purpose, and it doesn't disturb you, it doesn't worry you, and it rewards you. That is, in a fiction film, you present a simpler world in which cause and effect are logical. Things happen logically in relation to other events. And so you are immersed suddenly in a world where things are much simpler. Now, the documentary presents a world which is not satisfying. It's full of problems. And so, to some extent, people resist it, and to some extent, authorities suppress it and push it to the side. So it exists in that controversial area. Now, on the other hand, there is a certain passion that goes into the making of documentaries that I don't think exists in the people are making, doesn't quite exist in the more popular entertainment films, which are often made by people who have a very cynical view of what they're doing.
Yeah, maybe if documentaries were very well paid and have a large market, it would also face people who are just there to make money.
Oh yes, that's quite true. Yeah.
But at the same time, we have the news, which are supposedly short documentaries, which are very, very popular, and people watch it and don't like what they watch about wars, about disease, and so on. But it's very popular. It's on prime time. And so on. What's that difference of that proximity between documentaries, which are not seen and which are most costly and more deep, and news, which are rather superficial but so popular?
Well, the documentaries try to go into the causes of things. News only has to do with effects, results. You don't learn anything about a problem in news programs until it explodes into some kind of action. Then you see it, and without knowing what context it happened in and what produced that. The documentary tries to bring to light causes as well as results, which is a difficult thing to do.
And people don't not like to go deep on subjects. Prefer to see, war in Asia, let's say, instead of going deep what happened.
They're very happy to settle for simple explanations of things. That's true.
And quick.
And governments are likely to give very simple explanations of things, and so that the documentarist is almost always at war with the simple explanation. The good documentary, at least, is there is a, the really civilized man has to be very tolerant of ambiguities. In the fiction film, you tend toward people being good or bad. In the real world, you have to somehow face the fact that everybody has his reasons, and that's the difficulty. And in fact, even in the fiction film, the more interesting film to me is the film which is not between a good man and a bad man, and which allows you to think that the problems of the world come from bad people, and that they can be solved by killing or locking the bad people up. Now that is the message of most fiction film on television, that the world's problems come from bad people, and the whole problem is to get rid of them or to lock them up. And usually you get rid of them by violent action. And that's very attractive because it has an aspect of heroism about it. But it never solves problems. So you can't solve problems until you find out that most of the conflicts of the world don't come from good and bad people, but come from people who have different motives and different, which to them look as good as your motives look to you. So now some fiction films recognize that. Now Jean Renoir, for example, said, what fascinates me is that everyone has his reasons. So he liked to stage a conflict in which you are made to sympathize with various people who come into conflict and have reasons which impel them. And that's a far more interesting, not for light fiction, but for anything that provokes thought and so on. So I think to some extent, the mindless fiction that depends on good guys and bad guys is a disservice to society. And there is no way of suppressing it because it's the most basic form of communication.
Yes or no.
Yeah, that's right.
The news seems to put everything on a polarization, yes or no. It's always you have a choice between this and that.
Yeah.
In every aspect, they reduce everything, and you are against or pro or everything. What do you think that are the reason for that? That kind of simple thinking of people in yes or no, and not get involved really.
Well, I don't know. It's so basic. It's hard to say what causes that. But you are constantly confronted with dilemmas, and you want to solve them with as little difficulty as possible. And if you're told that the whole problem can be solved by killing off these people, you might very well feel that it's a good explanation, because it's not such a complicated explanation. The minute you start to delve into what's behind all these conflicts, they become more and more complicated. I mean, it's the complexity of events that creates this problem.
Good. Well, I think that's quite good. Would you have to? I'm trying to make connections between journalism and documentaries.
Right.
It seems that documentaries deals with causes, and the journalists with the facts. Would you have more connections?
Well, I think that the journalist should also deal with causes, and the difficulty is in television we have, you know, we have a half-hour news program on each network. It's on at the same time, so most people can't watch all of them. You watch one of them. You watch it either, you know, the CBS, NBC, or ABC, or in the recent years sometimes CNN, and they tell you in a half hour we will tell you what's going on in the world. Now this is ridiculous. How can you possibly? I mean, CBS used to end their program with, "Well, that's how it is," and then they mentioned the date. Well, it's absurd to pretend that in a half hour you are telling the news. It's called the news, which meant that anything we haven't mentioned is not really of any importance, isn't the news. Even the New York Times, which has many more pages, says it's printing all the news that's fit to print. Well, there's an awful lot of, what happens then is that you know, the news services and the photographic services, they're collecting things from all over the world. But every news operation immediately chooses those things which seem to have to do with the crises of the moment, so that you get and everything that is not very critical doesn't get covered at all. Now, the networks have correspondents, and the news services have correspondents in major cities in various parts of the world. For a while, our networks had correspondents in Rome. Part of their job was to cover Africa. Now, there's something absurd about that. So anyway, the events that happen to have in those major capitals where they have correspondents, we find out more about what's happening there than in other places. The other places don't erupt into when those erupt into the news, somebody used to be sent down from Rome and rushed down to Kenya to photograph and report on this, so he would spend 2 days there. Now, Vietnam, until we were well along into the Vietnam War, was covered from, I think, Hong Kong or from Tokyo. Somebody would go down there for a few days and bring back a report with some pictures, and that would go on television, tell you what's, you know,
going on.
Yeah, and you know, and all that time we had the CIA there and secret troops and things were, and when it broke up into large violence, then suddenly we have correspondents in Saigon also. Well, we never did have correspondents on the other side, Hanoi, so we didn't know what was going on there. We had a few people go there and take some photographs, and they were called traitors because they went there. So this is a very so the whole tendency of the scope of the news operation, the fact that we try to reduce it all to a half hour, makes for terrible simplification, and also makes for an emphasis on how our own people are involved in this. So the tendency to simplification necessary to condense the events of several hundred countries into 30 minutes is a terrible distorting fact.
And especially when you put emphasis on the crisis.
That's right.
Crisis? Where's the bomb? Where's the fire?
That's right. It's crisis oriented. Yeah. Now I have a book that I have just updated called Tube of Plenty: The Evolution of American Television, and particularly in the new edition that came out this year, I tried to say as much as I could about the dangers of that particular kind of emphasis.
That's a book about news on television, especially.
Yeah, well, it's a book about television. And news is yes, it's a book about both news and it's a book about television. Both it's so-called entertainment, and its so-called news, recognizing that to some extent entertainment is a news medium, and to some extent news is an entertainment medium. In fact, the pattern of a news program is planned like a variety program. They always end up with some nice little human interest item that will send you away in good humor, and they always start with something very dramatic to attract your attention. And somewhere you have a report from the president, from the White House, and which is usually an event that has been arranged for the camera, what do they call it? Well, it's they have a particular place at the White House where they set up these receptions for foreign people.
And they prepare everything to say what they want to say.
Yes, that's right. And even I have a picture of the Japanese ambassador being shown the markings in chalk where he's supposed to stand, so he'll be the right distance from the camera. So when he comes in, he knows where he's supposed to stand, and the president knows where he's going to stand because of the chalk marks that have been put on the floor, and the camera is all ready, so they don't have to spend a lot of time arranging that. So that's all planned beforehand. It's and there's something quite weird about it, you know. I mean, this becomes a staged event, you see. So I do go into some of that in this Tube of Plenty, the evolution of American television. So I've enjoyed writing these books, and the last I've done 8 books, which have all been published by Oxford University Press. Mm-hmm. And they've been very satisfactory to deal with, and they keep the books in print as long as they can. And they have also been the ones who published the encyclopedia.
Yeah.
So.
You could tell, just for finishing about your career in the last years, you either produce script writing, that's right?
Well,
you
yes.
teach, and also in the Library of Congress.
I began as a director, a radio director, who then went into radio writing. And then I was at National Broadcasting Company at the time when television was beginning, and I became active in television as a writer. So for some years and then I was asked to teach at Columbia, and for many years, for most of my life, I combined teaching at Columbia, film, radio, and television, with writing, and then with producing. So most of my life, professional life, has been at Columbia, combining teaching, producing, and writing. And then I retired in 1973, first of all, my writing was for the media, and then I was asked by Oxford University Press if I would like to write a 3-volume history of American broadcasting. So I spent 10 years doing that, and that I found more exciting than anything I had ever done. So I have now.
When was it? In which years?
Which years?
Yeah, you spent writing.
Well, the writing of books became my main occupation about 1960. I became very curious about the Indian film industry, and spent a year in India and worked on the history of the Indian film industry, called Indian film. And before I started that, I was asked by Oxford if I would do a 3-volume history of American broadcasting, radio and television. So the Indian film book came out in 1963. The first volume of the history of American broadcasting came out in '66. The second volume in '68, and the third volume in 1970. And then I published a condensation and updating, which is called Tube of Plenty. And then about the same time, I also published documentary which was followed by The Sponsor, and then by The Magician and the Cinema, and then by the three-volume encyclopedia. Now, and meanwhile, I also spent 5 years at the Library of Congress, 2 as a consultant and 3 years as the chief of the division. So I have had quite a, I think, a very fascinating life. I've enjoyed myself.
Yeah, like good and excellent literature production, really. What really impressed me, I first had contact with this book when I was in Brazil. George had a student, and we let me shoot it maybe. And